My question's for Dr. Flew. Dr. Habermas, he's given quite an enormous amount of evidence for the resurrection. Do you have any evidence as far as books or claims of people in early centuries disputing the resurrection? And if not, then why not? And seeing as how the disciples were going around at the very same time saying he did resurrect.
The majority of the people in Jerusalem at the time didn't believe it. I mean, that's one of the great shortages of evidence, which I pointed out at the beginning. One of the reasons I think the whole thing is so difficult to be sure of, we do not have anything at all from the non-believers in Christianity. We don't have any explanation as to why they were not converted.
Well, it seems to me that Paul was a skeptic and was against it, and James was a skeptic and against it, and it seems like Thomas was a skeptic and against it, and they all got converted.
Yes, they did, but these are the people we have heard about. But there wasn't a great sweep in Judea. After all, there were a lot of opponents, there were the persecutors and so on. They were not persuaded. And again, if the earthquakes and so on that are recorded in the Gospels and the darkening of the sky and so on did occur, we need some explanation as to why people were not persuaded by these dramatic things.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the non-Christian historical sources all mentioned that earthquake deal, didn't they, Gary?
Do they?
Yeah, Thallus in about 52 AD and Phlegon a few decades later both mention the darkness. Phlegon mentions the earthquakes. And this is an example, I mean, I want to be kind to him, but this is an example of what I said earlier. When he gets real close to the evidence, he pulls away. The question was, what first century evidence do we not have? Why don't we have any first century evidence? And he said, well, that's a great question. We don't have any first century evidence. And I'm thinking, then how is this position established? If the Christian can be asked to give first century evidence, we've had 3 hours of testimony on first century evidence. The critic should be able to produce some first century evidence. But he said that's a big gap. There isn't any. But that's the problem. No. There isn't any.
Say, wait a minute. First century, the question is, we don't have any evidence about what the people in Jerusalem, at the date we don't know, it was clearly round about 30 AD. And why they didn't accept this.
But there is no contrary evidence to the resurrection, except for the lone report. The Jews said the disciples stole the body, which he doesn't hold. Yeah. But there's no first century data. See, what I'm saying is we can be asked, Christians can be asked to produce first century data. And by the way, Josephus not only records the disciples' belief that he was raised from the dead, so does Phlegon. The same guy that records the earthquake and the darkness says, Phlegon now, a freedman of Emperor Hadrian, says Jesus appeared to his disciples and showed him his wounds so he could be touched. That's a non-Christian source about the end of the first century, 70 years later.
And doesn't Tacitus, isn't he the one that documents this happened under Tiberius Caesar and Pilate?
How is this man at the end supposed to know that what was happening in Jerusalem at that time?
He wrote a book called Chronicles, and he was an ancient historian or chronicler, and he thought there was enough data to record that. But I mean, my point is, there's no contrary data. And since there's no contrary data, if we're talking history now, and not philosophical worldviews and biases, or not bias, the question is, what first century data is there?
What do you mean by contrary data here? It's alleged that someone rose from the dead. What contrary data could there be other than a direct investigation of that particular case?
That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would be. But
you can't argue from the absence of evidence.
The other thing is, what would motivate people like Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus to put it in there?
But they didn't put in that, my goodness, a resurrection occurred there.
But Josephus does. The belief in it.
Ah, yes, and he says that people believed it, but that's a very different thing from producing evidence that it occurred.
Plus, Phlegon says he was raised and showed himself to his disciples, a freedman of Emperor Hadrian. He writes the Chronicles. He was born about 80 AD.
Yeah,
So it's a
and
pretty
to
early
argue
account.
that it didn't happen, but they put it in there anyway, would be saying that non-Christians are in on this conspiracy. In other words, what's the motivation for them to include it?
Well, the motivation will presumably be that they believed that this was said at the time, or they
And
believed
why would
that
they
this was
believe it
believed.
was said?
Well, they may have had some contacts with people who were there at the time.
Now, Tony, isn't that evidence? I mean, you take that for Tiberius Caesar. You said in the Craig debate that, you know, what we really need is something as strong as we have for Tiberius Caesar. We need something like that for Jesus Christ. We just don't have it. And I'm saying, what's different for Tiberius Caesar? Do you want to say that Tiberius Caesar didn't live, or Alexander the Great didn't live and do the things that he did because the data for Christ is actually better than Tiberius Caesar or for Alexander the Great?
Yeah, but the data about these chaps is not data about a miracle, is it?
But it's historical information that is better in the sense of recording what took place.
By the way, the Roman historians, he's right. On Tiberius Caesar, you've got 4 sources. On Jesus, you've got basically 4 major sources. An historian named Paterculus wrote about Tiberius, and he lived in his own lifetime. That's a great source. But the only problem is he wrote about Tiberius's military exploits, nothing about him being Caesar. All right, the next source for Tiberius is Tacitus, and it jumps 80 years. The next best one is Suetonius, jumps 90 years. And the 4th source for Tiberius is Dio Cassius, 212 AD, almost 200 years later. The best sources for Alexander are 3 to 4 centuries later. And yet we turn around and say, Mark's too far away at plus 40. Matthew and Luke are too far away at plus 50. John's too far away at plus 60. And we're not playing the same games, the rules of evidence here. And by the way, you say, well, they don't record miracles, but they do. They do. In Suetonius' account of Tiberius Caesar, he ends his chapter on Tiberius Caesar by talking about these miraculous prophecies and portents of coming things. And nobody shrinks back and says, he must be a loser and the history can't be history. But we do that stuff with Jesus. I wonder why the rules aren't the same.
Now, didn't Tony's old professor on ancient history, Sherwin White, tell you about all of that, Tony?
No, not about all of it. The one thing he was producing some evidence about was something to do with Herod, wasn't it?
What did he say about this,
Well,
Gary?
when he and I were dialoguing in 1985, I was talking about Sherwin White, and in his excellent book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, he was a specialist not only in Roman history, and a world-renowned specialist, but a specialist on Roman law. And that book, Roman Society, Roman Law in the New Testament, reads like F.F. Bruce or something. He's talking about all the points at which the New Testament's true. And I just brought this up in the debate to Tony in '85, and I said, what do you say about Sherwin White? And I was surprised when he said, far be it from me to disagree with my old Oxford tutor. And I had no idea that he'd studied under him at Oxford. So